Good morning, everyone, or should I say good afternoon. My name is Ryan Walks, and I am the current manager of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's Talent Development Program. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of our Building Bridges Symposium. This is my third season with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, and it has been an incredible and amazing journey. This is my favorite time of year because not only are we working to bring in a new class of TDP fellows through our audition process, we also get to celebrate our graduating seniors as they complete their journey with TDP. Each year, we close our season by hosting our annual spring recitals that feature performances from all the current students in the talent development program. This year, we've had to make some adjustments due to the pandemic. However, we were very privileged to have the opportunity to invite Okori Okecello Johnson to host a 1-hour concert premiere featuring performances from our graduating seniors, a debut of one of his own works, as well as recording the videos of the 21 other students that we made available online. To date, over 1,500 people have been able to tune in and watch this concert, and the numbers are still going up. As we work to create a new and re-energized path forward, it's exciting to take some of the key lessons away from how this year has been and apply them to our future, like the beautiful send-off we did for our graduating seniors. Yesterday, we had the opportunity to hear from professional and well-respected colleagues in the field on why the classical music field needs pathway programs, how to fund, build, and sustain successful pathway programs, and also tips for the current students in these programs on how they can master the art of taking auditions. Joseph Conyers brilliantly outlined 3 main points on why we need to build bridges: systemic racism, lack of opportunities, and lack of resources. These discussions have sparked many questions that are ongoing, such as how can we get young students of color interested in studying classical music? How can we get their communities to even invest in our field? What have we done to earn their trust? And interestingly enough, what can we do to help and collaborate with historical Black college and university music programs to better serve classically trained students who want to come to their campus to study music while getting the HBCU experience and also receiving the same quality instruction that is on the same level of the top conservatories? I know many of us listening yesterday and even in many events before our symposium have been wrestling with finding the solutions to these questions and are going to continue to do so to make sure that the field is enhanced for current and future generations of musicians to be able to do so, as Titus Underwood so brilliantly put, where they can feel comfortable, not just being present in the space, but also being culturally authentic while pursuing their true passions. You'll want to stay with us this afternoon as we have Kate Squirza Ingram of Create Today Consulting take a deep dive into the ASO's Talent Development Program Evaluation Project, followed by a conversation that I will lead with musician instructors and program advisors from Pathway programs. And we will close out today's session with an incredible discussion with Pathway program alums. Now, please join me in welcoming the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's Executive Director, Jennifer Barlament, along with Jonathan Saylors and Patrick Vigory from Innosight.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you again today. And hi, Patrick and Jonathan. Welcome to Building Bridges, day 2. Day 1 was really extraordinary. I'd like to thank Ryan for giving us that little bit of a recap from yesterday. So I wanted to give a little bit of a rewind to the genesis of this project that we're about to talk about in a minute. If you go back to June of 2020, obviously a lot was happening in the country. George Floyd had just been murdered, and we were all thinking about all of these issues related to race in the United States differently than we had perhaps previously. At the same time, here at the ASO, we were in the midst of the evaluation of the talent development program that you're about to hear about from Kate. And we started thinking about, obviously what can we do to further this work. How can we do it better? What else can we be doing? And then also on the challenging side, our TDP alums have been wildly successful in many areas in classical music. They've gotten into top conservatories and music schools, even winning competitions and getting full scholarships. Why aren't more of them playing in orchestras? What's going on in orchestras? And we've always said that our vision is to change the face of classical music, and we need to come to grips with what was happening in the field. So I started crunching numbers and trying to do a little bit of research and trying to figure out what the state of the research was out there, and how many Black and Latinx students graduate from conservatories, how many students in total graduate from conservatories, and are we on track? Are we doing as well as we can be with these students and for our alumni? And also, why haven't we made more progress as a field? So I was in the middle of having this conversation with our board member, Patrick Vigory, who's the managing partner of a really extraordinary consulting firm called Innosight. He's also a musician himself. He's the father of an aspiring orchestral musician who's a graduate of our Atlanta Symphony Youth Orchestra. And so he knows a lot about what it takes to become an orchestral musician. And it was a great conversation. It ultimately led to what you'll hear about in a few minutes. It's a major pro bono project with Jonathan Saylor on my left here, and he'll walk us through the data. We'll have a panel discussion afterward. But first, I'm delighted to introduce Patrick Vigory to share from his perspective why he and his colleagues at Innosight were motivated to make this incredibly generous donation of incredibly wonderful treasure trove of information and great perspective, which has led to a lot of important insight. So over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Jennifer, and hello, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here, and extraordinary set of conversations that you all are having, and so glad to be a part of it. Maybe I'll tell you a bit about the company Innosight that I'm a part of and Jonathan is a part of, and what makes us different. Innosight exists for one reason, and that is to help empower forward-thinking organizations to navigate disruptive change and own the future. We help companies and institutions and organizations imagine and build new ways to grow their businesses, often in markets that don't yet exist. So we continually try to work with our clients to help them look forward and think forward. And as we like to say, become the best version, the best next version of themselves. They tell us that we change the way they think and see the worlds in which they operate and enable them to do things that they never could do before. So that's our purpose, our fundamental purpose, reason for being. We were founded by someone named Clay Christensen, who sadly passed away last year. Clayton Christensen was a professor at Harvard Business School. He was one of the world's most influential business thinkers. He wrote a book back in the 90s called The Innovator's Dilemma, which brought an idea called disruption to the world. And it explained a lot about how companies that don't change quickly enough get passed by competitors and new entrants in their businesses. And this phenomenon of disruption is perhaps one of the most powerful forces shaping, for sure, the business world, but also it has applications much more broadly. Professor Christensen also thought very hard about what it takes to have a meaningful life. And perhaps his greatest contribution wasn't The Innovator's Dilemma, but it was a little book that you can read in an hour called How Will You Measure Your Life? It's all about thinking broadly and holistically about a scorecard for a life well lived. And we are a mission-driven organization, and we want to be a force for good in the world. And like many companies, the racial reckoning last year led to some real deep conversations among the Innosight team members about what we might do to help. We were specifically interested in helping organizations navigate sweeping social change, which is a form of disruptive change, especially addressing racism. In fact, we had a conversation, our whole company was an all hands meeting, and we said, what if we could apply the same approaches, the same lenses we use to help our clients solve their problems, to help the world figure out how we can have a world without racism? And that is a North Star. It's obviously a big problem, a big challenge. What would it look like? Where might we make a significant contribution? That conversation across our company and the discussion that Jennifer just talked about, where we were thinking through the orchestral music world and discussing the problems, those threads came together, and figuring out how to tackle this with the ASO and the steering committee is ultimately what created the project that Jonathan is about to walk us through. This is a question that is being asked by lots of organizations in lots of fields. The idea of increasing representation is really something that every industry is trying to address: law, medicine, consulting, et cetera, et cetera. There's ample evidence that diverse teams are more effective teams, that diverse organizations are healthier organizations, that diverse organizations are higher performing organizations. And that's a powerful motivator. That was a powerful motivator to us for doing this work. It was a real privilege, I would say, personally and professionally, to work with the ASO and the steering committee members on this effort. We were deeply humbled by the perspectives that people brought to the table, and proud of what the joint team was able to accomplish. That said, there's tons to be done, but we're excited about the opportunity and the possibilities ahead of us. So with that, thank you, Jennifer. And Jonathan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Well, very excited, and I'm going to go ahead and just get the presentation loaded here. It's quite the fun of doing all of this in a pandemic environment. I wish we were all together in Atlanta, which would be wonderful. So, as Patrick mentioned, we approached this work with a high degree of humility. And what was very clear to us from the beginning was that we need to recognize what our lived experiences were and how that altered or changed our view of this space. And you may notice that I am a strategy consultant now. I did graduate from Northwestern's Beanan School of Music as a voice and opera performance major, but I'm clearly not a Black orchestral professional musician. So, and neither was anyone on our team. And so it was clear to us that we were not going to be the experts here, and that the experts are those folks that have the lived experience of Black musicians. And so our North Star for this work was to always center and amplify the voice of the Black musician. And we wanted to understand and wanted to make sure we centered on that. And to that end, throughout this presentation, you'll see some quotes that we heard from many of the interviews that we did with orchestral musicians and subject matter experts, and also our steering committee. And we use these to contextualize what we learned and to make sure we are respecting the point of view that folks bring to the table. And we also wanted to look at, in addition to those primary interviews, use those to map the experience of what journeys professional Black musicians take and their points of departure where folks may take an alternative career path. We also wanted to look at findings from other industries and understand what we can learn from other fields, other industries, and then really distill that down to understand what makes a difference and how can we then collectively as an organization or as a field, I should say, really influence and impact those advancement factors to get to better and more diverse representation. So we obviously was not Patrick and I alone on this. Jennifer, Chelsea Sharpe, who we'll hear from in a bit, we're part of our core team. You can see our steering committee here was a group that has connections to the ASO, but also represents some folks that understand and have lived this journey. We did interviews with professional Black musicians, and you don't see their names here as those were insights that they shared confidentially, but we looked at folks and worked with folks that were across their careers, both early state. We wanted to make sure we're looking at differences in gender, in generation, and points of the journey. We talked to active music directors and also former professional musicians, folks that took an alternative viewpoint. The subject matter experts that we engage with in a slightly different way. Those interviews were folks, I'm sure you recognize some of the names here. I was proud that my alma mater, Northwestern, Tony Marie Montgomery, was able to participate. And also folks like Kathy Waller, who was the former CFO of the Coca-Cola Company and an ASO board member, to bring her experience to bear. So what did we learn? We learned that this problem is real. That there is a tremendous amount of talent out there in Black musicians, but that underrepresentation starts very early and continues to fall through each stage of this journey. So you can see in youth, folks that are beginning to pick up an instrument for the first time, about 6% of youth orchestras have Black musicians playing. When we hit the undergraduate and graduate, both conservatory and a non-conservatory environment, that drops to 3.1%. Pre-professional, if we think about New World Symphony, you have about 2.3%. And frankly, no one knows how many Black musicians are out there in the audition pools. We do know that only just under 2% of professional orchestras have African-American representation. And so obviously, if we compare that to the other race and ethnicities that are present in these phases, is very much lower. And if we compare it to the general population, is very much lower. So clearly there's something that needs to be solved here. This is probably one of the most interesting and impactful parts of the work for us, was the individual interviews that we did to really understand the journey. And the left-hand side of this talks about what was heard, and the right-hand side is what we heard about how these influenced and impacted Black musicians differently. So influential people drove people's lived experience, teaching those folks that are mentors, their colleagues and peers. But that impacts Black musicians in very different ways and often very disadvantaged ways. And that's because of the lack of representation, but also because of both unconscious bias and other factors where people are looking for people like them. And so that is a self-propagating problem. If you look at what musicians crave, we all crave the same thing: affirmation, belonging, really trying to focus on those things. And Black musicians, especially in the orchestra field, that experience of otherness is really impactful, of being the only or being the one in a group. And that pulls folks to other domains and other fields. There is being a professional musician is incredibly challenging. And I tip my hat to those of you that could make the switch from going from learning to doing. And I didn't have that drive and confidence, but folks really want to prove themselves. And Black musicians, they have that, but there's motivation and pressure. And those really impacts the mental game and the ability to play. Stereotype threat is real. and really focusing on what that is important. And resources. Classical music is expensive. And so given the socioeconomic realities, unfortunately, that may exclude and negatively impact Black musicians that are aspiring for something great. But that's not true for everyone. And we don't want to paint with a broad brush, but the concerns are real. So if the problem is deep in orchestral music, the question is it wide? It's obvious that we have challenges as a country. But if you look at law, medicine, and education, three fields that have really put a lot of effort here, we're not seeing a lot of movement. So within law, you're seeing, those numbers. Medicine, we have constant numbers of Black representation for Black men that are getting their MDs. And Black teachers in education has been constant as well since 1988. And so certainly the question is, well, why is that? And some of that may be obvious, but we wanted to take an approach to really dig into understanding why. So there were some good articles and some research that were done around diversity in the corporate space. One of the things that was on our first conversation with Jennifer and the steering committee is that there not been a study that was done specifically in classical music to understand diversity with the lens of Black orchestral musicians. And so that's what we really wanted to focus on doing. And so when we looked at this and talked to our subject matter experts, it was clear that there were 6 key themes that mattered. First, look familiar, amplify and represent the voices of minorities, really trying to make sure we are focusing in on that. And so this is true across the board. Mentorship is extremely important. Unconscious bias, it's real. We all have it in different ways. And we need to mitigate that bias and think about how that impacts decision-making and how that impacts talent. Transparency is extremely important. And we'll talk about the audition process in a bit. But so if we think about that, we need to understand why. We need to understand if a process was fair. And we learned that for many Black musicians, if the process is fair, the outcome is acceptable. But we need to know the process is fair. We need to share accountability, and we need to measure to improve. We really need to focus on metrics and tracking. And so that's what we learned was important in the corporate space. And so then we wanted to apply that and understand what are those advancement factors for Black orchestral musicians. So through our many, many hours of discussion, our primary interviews, we really were able to identify that throughout the journey, there were these advancement factors that made a difference. These are the things that moved folks along, that kept them focused, that kept them engaged, and really underpinned their success. I won't go through all of these, and in our panel discussion, we'll share a little bit more about how folks interpret this. Some things are obvious. Passion. We need to love the music. We need to be inspired by the music in order to be successful. We need to believe in ourselves and trust the system. We have to have the talent. That's clear. That's absolutely innate, but it is something that we learn, as you all have, over hours and hours and hours and hours in a lonely practice room. And then the teaching, the support, the network that we get along the way, that sense of belonging, encouragement, and support from our peers, financial resources, and then access and fit. One of the things that was interesting is we learned, if you look at the Coca-Cola company's journey, they spent a lot of time increasing Black representation in their ranks. Unfortunately, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal that talks about this. They've lost that representation. It's gone down because we have to change the culture so that folks are comfortable to be successful, to be their whole selves, and in order to make sure we focus on that. So the question was, what are the opportunity areas? What do we do about this? And so one is we need to focus on building mentorship and sponsorship opportunities, connecting to HBCUs, reaching out from the orchestra stage into the communities. We need to get better access to programs and resources, thinking about underserved communities, but thinking about all communities. How do we get out and expose people to the wonderful and beautiful and empowering music and what this community is. We need to think about the audition process. It's not always blind. It might not always be consistent throughout different orchestras. And so we want to make sure as we move forward, how do we make that a fair experience? And how do we make sure we don't disadvantage anyone in that? Authentic relationships with Black audiences. I think everyone since the very first time we ever picked up an instrument has heard, you know, classical music is a dying art. It certainly doesn't feel that way to me, but we need to increase our relationship with a broader audience base. And really important is we need to embrace the Black identity through evolving the repertoire. That's not to say we need to get rid of anything. It's add. This is an and conversation, not an or conversation. And we need to bring in additional composers and players and voices in a real and authentic way in order to make this impactful. So I talked a little bit about culture, and you know, this is a very, very challenging issue, as we all know. The transformation of the field is really focused by three main impediments to change. The first is real human concerns and anxieties. If things change, that's uncomfortable. Do I have to give up what I love? You know, if we say the process wasn't fair, the audition process, an example before, if I'm a seated musician, does that mean I didn't deserve what I achieved? Those are acute issues. And those are what we've heard and what people are concerned about. There's also this concept that the canon is superior and universal, that as defined, the European view of classical music is the answer and the best answer. And that's, you know, up for debate or false. But that's a narrative that protects itself and perpetuates itself. And then finally, the power of tradition. We all love what we love, and we joined this field for a reason. And my favorite quote, my favorite funny quote is, "Don't take away my Mahler." Yes, let's evolve the repertoire, but we love what we love. There's a reason why we want to play what we've played. And so that's really very, very important. So we think about what's important. This is extraordinarily important and worth the effort. That was clear to us from the beginning. I think it's clear to all of you. But we really want to focus on how we make a real and meaningful difference. And so when we think about how Black talent really impacts, it's about focusing on humanity. And it's about advancing this art and this field, the connection that it drives between all of us. And it will only survive and needs to be improved if more and more voices are included. So really getting at that is extraordinarily important. One of the fun exercises that we were able to do was think about what could an orchestra do? What could an orchestra be in the future? And so our steering committee spent some time to think about what would this be in the future? What could it be? And this is an exercise we've done with other organizations in a very different way. But we want orchestra to inspire the community, especially the youth. We want it to adapt with the community at a rapid pace and really inspire children of all backgrounds to love music. That doesn't mean they're all going to be players and all want to be seated orchestral musicians, but it does mean that they should have the opportunity to listen, to hear, and to experience what we were able to do. We want to think about what's the mission of a musician in an orchestra. Playing is of paramount importance, but how do we connect that to contributing their voices to the conversation more and really connecting with the community? And again, that's not an or, that's an and. And how do we think about that in the right way? And I'm thinking about performance beyond the canon. How do we think about collaborations in a real and authentic way for those players that are interested? My one regret of all of this is I had a dream that we would interview Lizzo, because she certainly is a great example of taking a classical background and doing something different yet extremely awesome with it. And unfortunately, she never answered my DMs, which was a problem, but I understand she's busy. But we think about where we could look in the future to see folks that are inspiring in many different ways. I want to wrap this up with probably a quote that impacted me the most, and I know for others on our team and in our group was pretty meaningful. We talk about why we center and amplify the voice of the Black musician, and this is why. It's because representation matters. Seeing someone like you changes your belief as to what you can do. And just standing on a stage, just being there, it makes a difference. And it empowers people to understand and to realize that they can do it too. And we see that in our vice president. We see that across the world, but we want to see more of it in classical music. Thank you all for the time and for the privilege of sharing this important work with you all. And we're now going to flip over to an interactive conversation with the panel. And so I'd like to invite Chelsea Sharpe, a very accomplished and talented player, Jen Arnold, who has had a great experience, and Jennifer back to the stage, or the virtual Zoom stage, to have this conversation. And also, please leverage the Q&A feature of Zoom to ask any questions. I want to make this as interactive as we can remotely. So the Q&A feature is up. You can see that right next to the chat. So thank you all, and we will transition. Chelsea, Jen, and Jennifer, thank you. And thank you for inviting us, Jennifer, to this conversation. And Chelsea and Jen, thank you for inviting us into this experience. As we get started, Chelsea, I'm gonna kick it to you first. You know, your role of being an active player, of being in the New World Symphony, you're on our steering committee, our core team, you participated in a lot of interviews, you have a really unique perspective on this. The advancement factors that we talked about and we shared and that we all co-developed, how is that the same or different from your lived experience? And second to that, how has this work influenced how you look at the journey of Black musicians, both you personally, but then also beyond that in the field at large?
Thanks so much for that question, Jonathan, and it's great to be here with everyone today. It was definitely really interesting to observe and learn from these stories via the interviews of so many amazing musicians representing such a variety of identities, whether that be age, gender, background, and to see what the commonalities were and their unique paths to mine and what I've witnessed in my experience. Some of the stories were really encouraging and positive and described individuals who had generally very good experiences in their paths, and then there were others that were kind of shocking and a bit alarming, and the kind of obstacles that these musicians had to go through that could have easily been remedied had these orchestral and also conservatory and college institutions been doing a better job of supporting their Black players. All of those advancement factors that you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, they resonate deeply with my own experience. And like you said, some of them are more or less self-explanatory. We know you need passion for the art form, for learning to succeed in this field. And a lot of musicians came from families and communities that deeply embraced music of all genres. And this ties to the belonging, encouragement, and support factor. But similar to my experience, that passion was nurtured at home, in school, public school, and also in religious settings. In most cases, the Christian church, which historically has always been a pillar in the Black community and such a strong example of community care. I certainly wasn't alone in that. My first audience at age 5, 6 was the church congregation. And those were really the folks before New World, before Rise, before Interlochen, before all that stuff. Those were the people who were significantly instrumental in encouraging me and in fostering an opportunity for me to develop and learn. So, you know, when we talk about ideas of how to earn the trust of our communities, And it always comes down to trust, right? Because you have to convince the community that you care and that you're invested in contributing positively, in addition to providing a product that's attractive, which is the music or the concert experience. I think when we talk about earning that trust and sharing our art in an effort to foster connection, there's some untapped opportunities there with the church, because musically is already so heavily embraced in that space. So there's just an observation that I left the experience with. Many players we talked to had other significant early experience with, like, maybe a recording or a particular inspiring performance. And something like that really jump-started their interest, so that there's that element of exposure that I also have a unique relationship to. I started playing violin only because of my mom. Shout out to mom. And she's not a musician, but yeah, yeah, clap. She's not a musician, but she had a really brief experience with playing the instrument. The way she describes it, she said a program outside of her New York City public school came in with beginner violins to teach the kids music in kindergarten, only for a year. And she suspects maybe they ran out of funding. They didn't return after that 1 year. And her family didn't have financial resources to kind of continue the lessons on her own. So that was really her first and last experience with playing, but it left such an impact on her that she grew up with this idea that she would provide this opportunity to her children. So fast forward several years, both my sister and I are placed into lessons at an early age. We're fortunate enough to be living in Atlanta, introduced and accepted into TDP. And then of course, many things happened in the years following, but now she has 2 professional musicians for daughters. And it was just from that one experience in school, that just the significance of that never escapes me. And I think what was really encouraging in those early years that is similar to the interviewees we talked to is, listening to random recordings. Like, for instance, for me, my mom would pick up from the now defunct bookstore, or my dad taking my sister and I to family concerts, or to see jazz violinist Regina Carter is like a really early memory that I have when she was in town. So in the stories, it wasn't necessarily a parent that provided that early exposure, but there was some sort of introduction in the school setting or through a teacher that left an impact, so much so that they were curious to develop. I could touch on all of the advancing factors. I don't want to eat up all the time. But those were the 2 that I think were really, really crucial. And also, I want to talk a little bit about the credentials. In my experience and from listening to these stories, it's definitely one of the most crucial advancement factors. I think often in this field, if you were fortunate enough to go to top schools and study in really competitive, well-respected studios, sometimes all you need to do is drop that name and many opportunities open up for you. I like when I was living in LA and in graduate school, I was really shocked actually when I started making that transition from student to professional, how I didn't really need to audition for certain things. I just needed to say my teacher's name, and the assumption was that I was very good and capable. And when we think about how sometimes there's a lot of gatekeeping in this field, and there's certain barriers that keep Black students and Black players from getting into these really, really tight-knit circles in these networks, then we have a little bit more insight into why we're not seeing the representation we desire. Of course, it takes a village, belonging, encouragement, support. And support is huge. There were players who experienced negative things like microaggressions, but then in the professional setting, I also heard disturbing things about illegal audition practices, and even having like other orchestral players make efforts to undermine and to threaten a Black player's tenure process or trial. And some cases, these were issues that the orchestra was aware of and wasn't taking care of. So there was a lack of support on that end, which resulted in the Black person not getting the job. And we already know about cost as being a prohibitive factor in all of those things. So I think in the end, I would say the work that we did has impacted my understanding in that I don't think the institutions are doing enough or giving enough attention to attract, foster, and retain the Black talent, because from what I heard, despite all the obstacles, Black people are still winning and advancing in auditions, but sometimes do not end up with the position in these majority Black cities. And I understand that auditions don't work out. I mean, that's just the reality. But I think if the orchestra is really trying to live up to the statement that they put out about DEI and supporting BLM and reckoning with contributions that they've made to creating the field as we see it today, there has to be prioritization, and there's cultural importance for diversifying the stage. And I'm not sure if that's being understood across the board. Of course, there's issues in the pipeline that can be remedied and addressed, but from my personal experience, there already are several capable, talented Black players ready for the job right now. And I think when we ignore that, it's sort of a distraction from how orchestras should be taking a look inward. The idea that making specialized efforts to diversify would be like a compromise of quality is a fallacy, and I really think that it's a necessity and should be prioritized. So when we look toward the future of a reimagined orchestra, we have to really like be specific in how we envision both the stage and the audience looking like. So that's brief, sorry, not so brief takeaway from all of this amazing work we were able to do with Innosight.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think we did talk about this for months, and we could talk about it for forever. It seems like. There's just so much richness that's here in what people were willing to share with us, and how we're able to bring that to bear. In prepping for this, I went through and reread all of the quotes we had pulled out, and really reflected a lot on both the good and the bad. There were some stories here that were incredibly inspiring, like that last quote that I shared, and there's just some tough things in there that are just hard to revisit. And that's where that lived experience is a challenging one. It's hard enough to be a professional musician, let alone to have additional barriers in the way. But Jen, I want to pick your brain a little bit. You've been successful and gotten around a lot of those barriers in many different roles. You've been a successful player. Now you're a successful administrator and artist. As you think about your journey, what can other experienced professionals take away to help young players and really to support their advancement? And what sort of guidance would you give the rest of us that seek to do the great work that you're focused on?
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Chelsea, shout out. I have to say everything you said. I love it. It was wonderful. For me, I think back on all the opportunities I had, and I had so many from a young age. But I will say one of the things I wrote down when I was thinking about this question is creating opportunities. So, that is exactly why I got into this position here, is that I wanted to create opportunities for people. So for Black players and Black conductors and composers and, things like that. But for me, I was thinking about the many people over the years who have created spaces for me. And I think often, like Chelsea was saying, credentials have a lot to do with those opportunities being given to certain people. And so I'm 100% with Chelsea. I even wrote down, like, take the non-traditional player or the non-traditional hire, as an administrator. I was a non-traditional hire. I consider myself a non-traditional hire, at least, things like that. They may not have the same resume, or they may not have the same, stepping stone. And in orchestras, we tend to be so tradition heavy that, like, oh, this person didn't do this path, so, are they even qualified? And especially what we found, I think, in this data, but Black players don't have a traditional path. Like, it's just not, whether players, administrators, whatever. It's often working musicians. I think we talked about that. I think there was a thing about a lot of people had to work in college. And I always say to people, some of my friends that are wonderful, wonderful players, all they had to do in college was practice. They didn't have to work. It's not hard to get I shouldn't say it's not hard, but when you have 8 to 10 hours to practice a day, it's a little bit easier to get certain positions in this country. So, because you have the time to practice. I was a working musician. So I know that I was building other skills while I was a working musician that later helped me in my administrative career. But I was going to just say the non-traditional path look at the non-traditional path and ask, whether it's a musician on their resume, whether it's an administrator or something like that, ask more about, oh, well, what were you doing during that time? Then, because they're probably building skills in different ways that are very, very helpful. And then I was going to say that one thing I think about is that top level leaders or people in, of course, leadership roles should take on Black mentees, excuse me. I find when I talk to people, because it's so network driven, especially in administration, that people come to me and ask me, who are these, who are the next people and things like that. And there are people out there, but there also need to be people who are fresh out of college. I think right now we're doing a lot of work here. My newest thing is I'm spending some time with HBCUs right now in this region. My mom went to an HBCU. She went to Central State University in Ohio, and she was a music major at Central State. She was the only violist, and she started me as well, Chelsea, in the Suzuki program in Cleveland. But I was going to say she majored in music, but because of the time and the resources, she just wasn't able to make that a career. She switched to education, later became a school principal, but she had a love of music. But from from probably when I was in high school, we would talk about some of the differences between my training and her training at her college. And so it's always been in the back of my mind, an HBCU network, but I was not in an administrative role, but now I am. And so, and we have some great ones here, Virginia State University is nearby and Virginia Union, and great faculty members. And I'm working with Ezra Hauerbooks, who is the orchestra director for Atlanta Centerwide Symphony with Clark, Atlanta, Morehouse, and Spelman on this music business series that we started here, mostly because of the fact that he told me a lot of his students have questions about our industry, and orchestra business is so closed, right? It's like insider baseball or whatever people say, and we need to talk about what we do, how to get people in and let them in, and then create space to let them in, So I think, especially when it comes to creating opportunities and mentorship, I think looking towards HBCUs in your region is very important. I think I know there's a huge network there. I spoke with the business school here at VUU recently, and they were like, we have to have interns, like they have to have an internship to graduate. And we have so many people who love the arts, it's paid internships, by the way. But it's, I think, a wealth and a huge opportunity for allowing Black people into our networks that have often been closed. So anyways, my thoughts have been like mentorship, taking a non-traditional hire, and creating opportunities. Those are kind of the three things that I think got me to where I am today.
Yeah. And Jen, one of the questions that's in the Q&A is about elitism in classical music, and frankly in all professions, and folks viewing that as a hurdle, and that you feel discouraged because there is a defined path. And as I went through my classical music journey, there's a certain way in which you study, there's a certain tonality you focus on, and there's a certain path that you go on. And you spoke about the sort of the variant paths that Black musicians may go on for a variety of factors. Are you seeing that the field as a whole are more open to embracing folks that have a different background and path, or what additional work remains to be done there, and how might you leverage your HBCU connections and work that you're doing there to maybe demonstrate to the world that there are more Jens out there?
I do. I just think that, I think the traditional path is kind of I think that's much more in administration in my head. Well, I guess there is a traditional path for like orchestra and conservatory, and having certain, I was in one of those studios, so I know you can drop your teacher's name and get on an audition list, or. So I think more orchestras right now are looking at removing things on resumes that
Mhm.
allow for that, and they should be in the audition process. I mean, so-and-so studio shouldn't always, uh, get first dibs at that. So, or pre-advancement, things like that. So I do think the industry is changing. I mean, we'll see actually in the next couple of
Yeah.
months who is changing, right? So,
Yeah.
but I think it feels like there's movement in the industry for it. I'm not sure
Yeah.
how I believe also, like, at looking at the industry as a whole and questioning everything. I always say this, but I question everything. I question, why do we still do auditions the way we do? Let's review, which is why we're doing, having data.
Yeah.
Why are we doing this way? Why are we doing, like, it's time to ask ourselves, like, why do we need to hold on to this anymore? Those kind of things. So I kind of look at it as an industry as a whole, because we've been doing things for so long the same way.
Yeah.
From every aspect. So I think in terms of HBCUs, I believe that if we look at the industry and change things, from auditionings and how we hire to people in administration, it'll benefit Black people,
Yeah. Well, and I think when we talked about the audition process, which was a long conversation, a very interesting one, because I think we all learned a lot about what's consistent and not, and different experiences. But the idea of, you have a resume round. Do you actually have a resume round, first of all? Second of all, do you take out identifying information? And so that's an interesting, it has an upside and a downside, because at the same time, if I was able to study with a top teacher and top player, then there's advantages that go with that. I earned that spot, and I want to be recognized for that. At the same time, I don't want to be disadvantaged if I didn't. And so I think that was a challenge to wrestle with, and I think deserves a lot more conversation. The other thing that from other industry research that came to mind that resonates with this for me, so I live in San Francisco, so a lot of my friends are in the tech industry. And so one of the things that Google does is they take folks that are coming out of HBCUs or that are otherwise very talented coders or have the potential to be very talented coders, but don't have the same background. And so they would walk into an interview and not do as well because they don't know how to interview. And it's not that they're not talented or great or have the skill set to be successful, it's they don't know what to do. And so Google has a program where they take those individuals and they put them in a program for 6 months or a year where they teach them how to do that. So realizing they have the raw talent but need to be guided. And there's that mentorship aspect, I think, it connects to a conversation we were having around some folks come to, there's a quote about showing up at Interlock and realizing like all of these kids have been studying since 4 and they all know how to audition, and that's not always true. And so I just think that's interesting to think about how we can support musicians like in the TDP and others that need not a help with being talented and not with help with being they need to learn and be invited in to understand what the world might look like and how they could be successful. And I think that also connects back to this idea of elitism. And so really trying to invite people in as opposed to proving that you have to be good enough to be there. We know the talent is there. We know that the skill set is there. It's more of making sure we're creating a space for those individuals. Is my perspective. And just a reminder, if you have any more questions, the Q&A feature, please use it. Jennifer, I wanted to get your perspective here. So you've got an awesome role at the ASO to advance classical music, to really think about how the impact that orchestras can have on the community. You've done some great work, and the institution has done some great work with the TDP and others. Your journey towards becoming anti-racist as an organization, supporting young and diverse musicians, just doing so much, which is awesome. What would your advice, or what do you want your peers and other orchestras to learn from this work and what the ASO is doing And how can the ASO be an even more galvanizing force in the field?
Well, thank you for that question. That's a biggie. But I'll start with the first part. What do I want people to take away from? I would say, for one thing, this is an incredibly rich set of information. And so there's a lot to take away. So I'll just hit a couple of high points. One of my big aha moments in going through this was how much other fields struggle with the question of representation as well. And so there are models out there. They aren't perfect, but there are some strategies that we know do work and don't work. And you've provided us with a good, really good list of those. The second takeaway that was a big aha moment for me was actually part of the conversation about the design of the study is, and not that this was a big revelation, but it's just different to live life as a Black person in the United States. You have a different experience. Not that it isn't also different for other minorities, but there's something very specific about that experience. And there's a multiplicity of experiences out there. And musicians were very generous in sharing their perspectives, and hearing those and hearing enough of them together gives you a much better picture than just really relying on one person to ask the questions of. And so having this body of interviews and the quotes and experiences I found incredibly compelling. So that's just kind of part of the takeaways. The other thing that I've in terms of how I feel like we can help the field and what our kind of motivation is behind this. One is you can't change what you don't understand. And so, we're really committed to the regular exercise of compiling and sharing data that will yield richer conversations in the field. In my observation, I've seen and experienced a lot of guilt response, a lot of fear, and that tends to have a stymieing impact on dialogue and action. And we're very much committed to continuing to try, despite the fact that we're deeply imperfect as an institution, have a long way to go to keep trying to press through and have the conversation. So there are three things, I think about as an institution. We're not going to just stop with what we've been doing in the past. We're trying to learn and change. Second, as I mentioned earlier, sharing. And third, by making critical investments. So there's a lot of changes coming at the Atlanta Symphony, but I thought it might be good to just kind of run through some of the changes that we've either committed to already or in the process of committing to as a result of the work that you all have done. So first, so much of this comes from the board, and we have an incredibly committed board who have committed to raising $5 million to support DEI initiatives over the next 5 years at the ASO. Second, we're in the process of implementing some improvements, changes to the talent development program based partly on this work and partly on the evaluation you'll hear about in a little bit. Third, we're increasing the size of the talent development program. Fourth, we're building a way to remain in contact and continue providing that mentorship and support to the alumni of the program. Fifth, and this is not a done deal yet, but we're certainly deep into conversations about creating a fellowship program. Next, we're have a long-range audition task force that is in the process of already making some important recommended changes to our orchestra audition process, and will continue meeting over the long term. And we're making a significant investment in additional staffing at the ASO to support these programs. And at the board level, we have a DEI task force of the board and advisory council that's helping advise us and has created a plan, a vision and commitments plan for us. So the one thing I was going to share in terms of things that we can do together. the orchestra field has a national pool of potential employees, right? So everything we do in our community may or may not accrue to the benefit of ourselves in the long run, but it will help feed a more diverse pipeline of musicians and potential staff members. And so, I think anything any of us individually does can have major benefit. And so my hope would be that others, as a result, partly of these conversations, feel compelled to or feel emboldened to do something like the talent development program, maybe, because that could have significant long-term impact. And one of the things that I found most enlightening from the process of contacting alumni of the talent development program is that 85% of them had not had any significant relationship with the ASO before becoming students in the program, which means, I think that means that, there would have been 85% fewer young people who are Black and Latinx going into careers in classical music. So if we all, go out there and say, hey, we want to support you and do that successfully, we can make a difference.
Yeah. And I think that idea of supporting folks and providing opportunities, I think that's what we saw in the nature of the research. And thank you for whomever sent the comment over. I just want to really clarify that point. This is not a question of talent or underperformance across any industry. There are structural challenges that exist that cause us to end up with having not the right balance of representation in the orchestral field, but beyond that in all fields. And so what was clear to us from day one is you could fill almost every seat in the orchestra with Black players at the right talent that had passion, successful, and still have this amazing art form. And that's true for many other fields, although not, there still is a lack of representation in many. And so one of the narratives I think that we debunked was this idea that you had to sacrifice quality to advance diversity. And Chelsea and Jen, I'm just would love to hear more of your perspective on that, because you two are great examples of this, but there's many, many others of how that narrative is out there and how do we really combat it to really show and demonstrate that this is not a sacrifice of anything. It's an advancement and not an or.
Yeah, I think we have to be honest in assessing where that idea comes from. The idea that like hiring more Black talented players would somehow compromise, like that's inherently racist, right? And so like just naming it, calling it for what it is, and understanding that it's not true. And there are like endless examples. I mean, you can look in Atlanta, you can look at Sphinx. There's so many organizations that have done the work to support these players and highlight these players. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know solve
Yeah.
but I mean, at first, like naming the issue for what it is, I think is probably the first step. But just providing the opportunity, and I think the players and the performance will speak for themselves.
Yeah, I'm reminded of one of the concepts that we talked about is about creating space, and it's you create the right space and it gets filled with amazing things, but we have to be intentional about creating that space. In addition to being able to allow for people to make change and supporting folks. And so I think it's both those things. But Jen, other comments there?
Yeah, I think you touched on it earlier in the slide deck, that being accountable and honest about how people get jobs, right? We talk about this a lot, but I say that because I was doing a session with Alex Lang for something, and a player was suggesting that the talent wasn't there in auditions. And I was like, well, how did you get your job? And, you know, like, because that's what, I mean, because that's how the business is. Like, I like to ask, that's like my new favorite question. How did you get your job? I ask it of musicians in orchestra and administrators, just because I want to see how, you know, people are getting their jobs. So this particular player said, well, I was pre-advanced because I had played with the orchestra for many years, you know, and put in the whatever round. And I'm like, and this is my case in point, right? You know, so it's like there is this idea out there, like you said, Chelsea, that, you know, the talent isn't out there, but that talent is out there. They just need to have the same experience, you know, and I think the NAS guidelines, which have become kind of controversial, I don't know why though, I think they're very good and necessary. And I hope everyone on this who's watching this knows what those guidelines are. But I mean, it basically says like either make it open or give everyone the same opportunity for pre-advancement, which I think is exactly, you know, what you were saying before about Black people like are okay with the outcome if it's fair, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's hopefully universal, right? Like if I'm judged fairly on my performance and I feel okay with the outcome, it's when it's not. And there's another question about the audition process that we just touched on. And the NAS approach is seeking to standardize that audition process across the field because it's not the same. Some places have different rounds. Some people have resume rounds, pre-advancement, no pre-advancements, appointments, no appointments, screens, no screens, bring the screen down, don't bring the screen down. So that was a fun thing. One of the things that we sought to do and in the process to advance this work is a survey of professionally seated Black musicians across a whole host of orchestras. Excuse me, I said that wrong. It's actually of professional orchestral musicians that are seated, period, of all races, ethnicities, and genders, to be able to compare and contrast how they got their job. And so while we don't yet have those conclusions back, one of the questions is around what was the audition process? And we heard in the interviews and we see in the early data that it's not consistent. And that's not to say that's inherently wrong. It's to say, Jen, I think what you highlighted of just make it fair. If you're gonna pre-advance everybody. If you're not gonna pre-advance, don't pre-advance anybody. Same with screens and things like that. So I think that's a great example of sort of the power of tradition. Like there is a way in which the audition process has worked, but it's not been the same. And so, you know, the question is it possible to change the process? Yeah, I mean, we can change anything. Whether or not that, it's the speed of change, I think is important. And that's where, in addition to creating a space for talented players, it's ensuring that folks that are in positions that can adopt and get behind things like the NAS recommendations, understand how important that is, and they don't dismiss that. And hopefully, I would agree, Jen, hopefully no one does. Time will tell. The next couple of months, we'll see. But that's important.
Add, Jonathan, real quick, something that it just made, what you said just made me think of something. Earlier this year, I was doing a little talk with a orchestra that's non-union, and they are struggling with diversifying their orchestra, except it's a non-union orchestra. And so I'm like, how do you know, it's not even really auditions, it's kind of just like recommendations and things like that. So it just made me think about how deep the bias is and the idea of the talent isn't there. It happens, I mean, the audition language in CB8 orchestras is a process you have to go through, but even orchestras that don't have those barriers are struggling with this. And so that's how deep it is in our industry, and why we have to just look at, you know, our networks and increasing our networks and allowing opportunities for people.
Yeah. So we have one last question in the chat here about Black composers. And when we first started our conversation, we were really focused on listening to Black players and listening to Black composers. And there's just so much out there that folks haven't heard. And Jen's been called one of the foremost experts on black composers. I don't know where that came from either. I don't know, but I'm going to quote you on it. It's your new title. Add it to your resume. Thank you for that. You can write a book now. But you know, Chelsea, Jen, and Jennifer, as you are looking out there, are there up and coming Black composers? Let me rephrase that. There are up and coming Black composers. Are you seeing those folks getting commissions, and are those folks that you're seeing you and your peers are excited to play, and an audience is excited to listen to?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that question. As a lover of new music and diverse perspectives, I really appreciate that question specifically. And there's definitely been, I think a lot of modern living Black composers have experienced considerable increase in their work post George Floyd, and I think we have to contend with why that is. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea to commission more Black artists. When we don't do that, we're leaving out entire perspectives that are so valuable to the current climate, and also just, I mean, even if it's not tied to the current socio-political climate, also just like additional perspectives in general. I've seen a lot of orchestras programming the work of Jussie Montgomery, who is a personal favorite, and Miami-bred Daniel Bernard Romaine, and I know New World did some works with Paviel and Marcus Norris and Joel Thompson. So, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of living Black composers, modern composers, getting their stuff programmed, but I have to wonder, after the hype and all of the attention, according, to Black Lives Matter sort of starts to die down, will these composers still have the same opportunities?
Yeah.
And I hope that they endure, but I have to be skeptical, because often we we see trends.
Well, and go ahead, Jen. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, for sure. And the ones that are really well commissioned and getting played a lot are passing, the work to other newer composers and younger composers. I think, agreeing with Chelsea, from the people I've been talking to, they're getting a lot of work. But I will say this, because of the time, they're getting very specific work in commissions. And I think that is really frustrating. I don't even know if they're worried that the next work won't come, but like being boxed in to a 3-minute piece about George Floyd, that's what's really frustrating, I think, for composers right now. Black composers are not having the freedom to write and just get a commission, and so I think that needs to be looked at and thought about, because it can be triggering for some.
Yeah. And certainly live performances right now are a little hard to come by. I am hopeful that the recent changes in the pandemic stick, and we can get back to not life as we used to have it, because I think there's some things that we should learn and do differently. And the realization that the country's had is it's unfortunate that it's taken as long as it has. But I'm very excited that it's happened nonetheless. And so I'm going to close us out, and we're going to listen to a really exciting piece here. I just encourage us to think about in our roles and in our everyday life, in our professional life, in our personal life. The biggest impact that I'm taking away from all of this is the creation of space, and filling that space by centering and amplifying through the voice of Black musicians in this space, but through the voice of minorities in other spaces, and applying that and taking that to my work that I do with other industries and fields, which is really exciting. And I am so thankful for the ability to have joined you all on this journey, for the trust that you allowed me to build with you all, to create some of these. These are hard conversations to have, and I recognize how blessed I am to be able to have this experience. And it's not just me and Patrick. We have a team of folks that were involved, and I would be remiss to not mention Kristen and Scott and Marianne and Catherine, who just did absolutely phenomenal work in this space. And we all are very excited to move this forward and get the survey results to them. So thank you all, Jennifer, Jen, and Chelsea for your words here, and to the audience for the questions. And I'm very excited to introduce our next artist, Sage Harrison. She is a Talent Development Program Harpe Fellow, playing the first arabesque by one of my favorite artists, Debussy.